Imagine giving $500,000 to the man you believed would be your partner for life, only to wake up one morning and realize he was gone. No note on the counter, no message on the phone, not even a trace of where he might have gone. The apartment felt empty in a way Amelia had never known before, and the silence was heavier than any heartbreak she had imagined. All she had left were the memories of promises he had whispered, dreams of a shared future, a house with a porch, a life built together. Amelia Grant had always been careful with her choices, especially when it came to money. She worked as a financial analyst, she knew numbers, she knew risks. But Colton Hale wasn't just another decision. He was the man she thought she could finally trust after years of keeping her guard up. His smile had a way of pulling her in, his confidence making her feel safe. For the first time, she let her heart lead instead of her head. Colton had spoken with such certainty about the restaurant idea. He painted pictures of a warm, elegant place where families would gather, couples would celebrate anniversaries, and friends would linger over glasses of wine. He promised Amelia that her father's inheritance wouldn't just sit in a bank account. It would grow, it would build something meaningful. She wanted to believe in him, and against her usual caution, she did. The night before he disappeared, everything seemed normal. They had dinner together, laughing over a bottle of wine, talking about Paris as if it were a dream vacation waiting just around the corner. Amelia had gone to bed smiling, thinking life was finally falling into place. But by morning, Colton was gone. His closet was cleared, his phone disconnected, and the joint account they had set up was drained. The number $500,000 stared back at her in red on her bank statement, gone in a single transaction. At first, Amelia thought there had to be some mistake. She called hospitals, airports, friends, anyone who might know where he had gone. The police filed a report but offered little hope, explaining that when adults disappear by choice, it's difficult to trace them. Each passing hour turned hope into dread, dread into anger. That was when she found the crumpled paper at the bottom of their trash bin, a ticket stub, first class, one way to Paris. The realization hit her like a storm. He hadn't just left, he had planned it. Every word of love, every promise of forever, had been carefully crafted lies leading to this moment. Amelia felt her chest tighten, but beneath the ache was something else, fire. She wasn't the kind of woman to fold under betrayal. She had lost her money, yes, but she refused to lose herself. Paris was where he ran, and Paris was where she would go. She didn't want revenge for the sake of cruelty. She wanted answers, and more than that, she wanted to look him in the eye and let him see that she was not broken. What he found in Paris would not be the freedom he expected. It would be the beginning of his downfall. When Amelia thought back to the first time she met Colton, it felt almost unreal. She had gone to a friend's engagement party, not expecting much, just another evening of polite smiles and small talk. But then Colton appeared, tall, confident, with a voice that carried warmth and charm. He struck up a conversation as though they had known each other for years, and for the first time in a long while, Amelia felt seen. He asked about her work, her interests, and he listened with an intensity that made her believe every word she said mattered. He didn't wait days to call. The very next morning, she found flowers at her office desk with a simple note that said, "Dinner tonight?" It was bold, but it felt refreshing. At dinner, he told stories about the places he had traveled, the food he had tasted, and the people he had met. He made her laugh until her cheeks hurt, and when he spoke of his dreams, his eyes shone like someone who was destined for more. He talked about creating something lasting, something bigger than himself, and Amelia was drawn to that vision. Colton's promises were never vague. He painted pictures of what life could be like with him. A home that echoed with laughter, holidays spent in new countries, a shared purpose where both of them worked toward building a future that was theirs alone. He spoke with such conviction that it was impossible not to be swept away. Amelia had always been cautious with men, but Colton had a way of making her feel safe enough to let her guard down. He made grand gestures that carried weight. On her birthday, he booked a weekend trip to a vineyard, saying he wanted her to see where their restaurant wine list would someday come from. When she worked late nights, he waited outside her office with takeout, telling her she shouldn't have to come home to an empty apartment. When her mother fell ill, he drove hours just to bring soup and sit with them quietly, as though he belonged. His actions matched his words, and that was what convinced Amelia to trust him. The restaurant dream became a constant topic between them. Colton described the details as if the place already existed. He spoke of rustic wood tables, walls lined with photographs from their travels, a menu that blended American comfort food with European elegance. He didn't just want to run a business, he wanted them to run it together. Amelia could almost hear the chatter of guests, smell the dishes, and feel the pride of watching their vision come alive. Travel was another promise that colored their conversations. Colton loved to say that the world was too big to stay in one place. He wanted them to see Paris in the spring, Florence in the summer, and the snowy streets of Prague in winter. Amelia, who had always put work before adventure, felt a spark she hadn't known she was missing. He didn't just talk about going. He convinced her it would happen, that their future was full of stamps and passports and stories worth telling. To Amelia, Colton became more than a man she loved. He was the hope of stability and excitement blended into one. He carried himself like someone who could provide both security and adventure, and she believed he meant every word. She had always imagined her life as steady but quiet, yet with him, it seemed the world could finally open up. Looking back, Amelia realized how carefully he had spoken, how perfectly his dreams aligned with what she had always longed for. At the time, though, she didn't question it. She wanted to believe him, and so she did. Amelia had always guarded her father's inheritance with care. It wasn't just money sitting in an account. It was the last tangible gift from the man who had raised her with discipline and quiet strength. Her father had worked long hours in construction, saving every penny with the hope that his daughter would have a better life. For Amelia, that $500,000 was a symbol of sacrifice and love, not just a number on paper. When Colton brought up the idea of investing it, Amelia hesitated. She reminded him that the money wasn't hers to gamble with lightly. But Colton never pressured outright. He guided, persuaded, and assured. He laid out architectural blueprints of the restaurant he wanted to build, with detailed floor plans and cost breakdowns that looked polished and convincing. He showed her documents with names of supposed partners and suppliers, describing their credibility and connections. Each time she raised a concern, he had an answer ready, steady and confident, as if every angle had already been covered. He told her the project wasn't a risk, it was an opportunity. "This isn't just about business," he said one night while they sat at the kitchen table, papers spread around them. "It's about building our life together. Imagine walking into a restaurant that's ours, where every detail has our fingerprint. This isn't money disappearing, Amelia, it's money multiplying." He promised that within 1 year, her father's gift would not only remain intact, but double in value. The certainty in his tone made her want to believe. Amelia's cautious nature urged her to slow down. She even drafted pros and cons on her notepad, staring at the numbers until her head hurt. But Colton's presence beside her softened the edges of her doubt. He didn't dismiss her worries, he soothed them with patience. When she voiced fears of losing it all, he leaned across the table, took her hands, and said, "I would never risk what matters most to you. This isn't just money, it's your father's legacy. I would protect that with my life." That promise pierced through her defenses. Trusting him felt like trusting the future they had been weaving together since the day they met. Amelia reminded herself that love meant sharing not only dreams but also risks. If they were truly building a life side by side, she couldn't stand back and treat Colton like a stranger in financial matters. Signing over the money became, in her heart, a declaration that she believed in him, in them, in everything he had painted so vividly. The day she transferred the funds, her stomach twisted with unease, but Colton's smile dissolved the tension. He kissed her forehead and said, "You won't regret this. You've just secured our future." She wanted those words to be true more than anything. For Amelia, it wasn't just a business transaction. It was a test of faith, and she chose to believe. With the click of a button, $500,000 left her account and moved into Colton's hand. In that moment, she didn't think of loss or betrayal. She thought of her father's memory fueling the life she hoped to build, and she thought of Colton as the man who would make it possible. The morning Amelia realized Colton was gone, the air in the apartment felt wrong. She woke to silence that pressed down on her chest. His shoes were no longer by the door, his jacket missing from the hook, and the drawer where he kept his passport sat wide open. At first, she thought maybe he had left early for a meeting, but the emptiness was too sharp to ignore. She checked her phone, expecting a text, but there was nothing. Hours passed, and the quiet grew heavier. By evening, panic started to creep in. She called his number again and again, only to hear the same mechanical message that the line had been disconnected. She drove to his apartment across town, hoping for some explanation, but when she opened the door with the spare key, she froze. The place was stripped bare. Clothes gone, toiletries missing, drawers emptied. It didn't look like someone had stepped out. It looked like someone had erased himself. Her chest burned as she dialed the police. Filing the report felt surreal, as though she were talking about someone else's nightmare. She gave them his details, their shared accounts, the timeline of his disappearance. The officer nodded politely but reminded her that adults often leave by choice, and unless there was evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. Those words rattled her. Choice. He had chosen this. She contacted her bank next, her hands trembling as she waited on hold. The representative confirmed her worst fear. The joint account had been emptied in one clean transaction. Every last dollar of the money she had transferred was gone. Amelia's throat tightened until she could barely speak. She reached out to a lawyer, but even he explained that without proof of fraud or written agreements, her options were limited. Colton had planned this carefully, leaving no trace of broken promises on paper. Each night, Amelia sat in her father's armchair, staring at the walls, trying to understand how a man she had trusted could vanish so completely. The life she thought she was building had shattered in an instant. Sleep never came easy, and when it did, she dreamed of his voice, his laugh, the look in his eyes when he swore she was safe with him. Waking was worse because reality hit again and again like a hammer. Days later, while sorting through the trash she had ignored in her panic, she found it. A small, crumpled piece of paper stuck between receipts and empty envelopes. When she smoothed it out, her stomach lurched. A first-class ticket stub, dated just one day after the money transfer. The destination printed in bold letters, Paris. Her breath caught as she stared at the word. Paris wasn't an accident, it was his escape. The puzzle pieces slammed together in her mind. He hadn't vanished in confusion or danger. He had run, planned it all, and left her behind with nothing. The man who once promised her a life together had stolen everything and boarded a plane to a new world. Amelia's grief twisted into something sharper. Paris was not the end of the trail. It was the beginning. She wasn't done, not yet. Amelia stepped off the plane in Paris with a single suitcase and a heart that felt heavier than the luggage in her hand. The city around her buzzed with life, taxi horns, hurried voices, and the hum of strangers rushing past. But she felt cut off from it all. She wasn't there to admire the Eiffel Tower or taste croissants at a cafe. She was there because the man she trusted most had stolen her future and hidden himself among these streets. The first nights were the hardest. She stayed in a small hotel, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had been foolish to come. But each time doubt crept in, she pulled out the ticket stub she had found, reminding herself this was real. Somewhere in this city, Colton was living off her father's inheritance, and she couldn't go back home until she saw it with her own eyes. Amelia started with the bank receipts she had managed to trace. They pointed to transactions in expensive neighborhoods, places she had only read about in travel books. She walked through those streets, her eyes scanning every doorway, every cafe terrace, searching for a familiar face. Most days she found nothing but sore feet and exhaustion, yet she pressed on. Giving up wasn't an option. One evening, while sitting alone at a cafe near the Seine, she overheard two waiters talking in English about an American man who tipped with €100 notes like they were candy wrappers. They laughed about his arrogance and mentioned the hotel where he stayed. Amelia's chest tightened. She jotted down the name, her hands shaking. It wasn't confirmation yet, but it was a thread, and she clung to it. The hotel they spoke of was far beyond anything Amelia could afford. She walked through the lobby pretending to be a guest, her heart pounding as she glanced around. The marble floors gleamed, chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the air smelled of expensive perfume. She asked at the desk if Mr. Hale was staying there, masking her voice with casual curiosity. The clerk's polite refusal told her nothing, but the flicker in his eyes told her enough. He was there, or he had been. With every step she took in that city, her pain grew sharper. She imagined him laughing in restaurants, drinking fine wine, maybe holding someone else's hand across the table while she wandered alone. The thought stung worse than losing the money. It wasn't just betrayal of trust, it was betrayal of her worth. He had decided she wasn't even worth a goodbye. Yet with each wound came strength. She realized she wasn't chasing him for the inheritance anymore. She wanted to face him, to take back the power he had stolen when he walked out of her life. Dignity meant more than dollars, and she wouldn't rest until she stood in front of him again. Paris was vast and full of shadows, but Amelia had already survived the darkest night of her life. She knew she could follow those fragments until they led her straight to him. Amelia's search stretched into weeks before it finally happened. She had walked past countless cafes and hotel terraces, her eyes scanning faces until her vision blurred. Then one bright afternoon, while crossing a cobblestone street near the left bank, she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. There he was, Colton, sitting at a terrace table as though he owned the world. He hadn't changed. His hair was neatly styled, his shirt crisp, his smile wide and careless. But he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman who looked like she belonged in a magazine. Elegant, poised, with dark hair swept back in jewelry that caught the sun, she laughed at something Colton said. The sight felt like a punch to Amelia's chest. She lingered across the street, hidden by the flow of pedestrians, her heart racing so hard it almost drowned out the noise of the city. She watched Colton lift a glass of wine, laughing in that same familiar way he once laughed with. Only now he wasn't broke, desperate, or ashamed. He looked comfortable, thriving even. Later, Amelia learned the woman's name was Sabine Moreau, a French gallery owner known for her fortune and connections. It didn't take long to understand what had happened. Colton hadn't run to Paris to disappear. He had run there to upgrade his life. He had taken her father's inheritance and used it as a ticket into circles Amelia could never have entered. Her chest burned as she realized the truth. While she had been wandering the city, exhausted and heartsick. He had been living out his dream in broad daylight, as though the past never existed. He spent the money she had entrusted to him on luxury hotels, fine food, and expensive gifts for another woman. Every detail she noticed, his designer watch, the tailored jacket, the effortless charm, was funded by the very legacy meant to secure her own future. For a moment, grief nearly swallowed her. She felt the tears rising, but she forced them back. Standing there on the busy street, Amelia made a choice. This would not be the end of her story. Colton had built a life on lies, and he believed she was gone, broken, too powerless to confront him. He thought he had erased her, but watching him so smug, so certain, turned her pain into something harder, sharper. Resolve. She wouldn't scream across the terrace or beg for her money back. That would only feed his arrogance. No, she would be patient. She would gather what she needed, and when the moment came, he wouldn't just lose money. He would lose everything he had built from her father's inheritance. Amelia turned away from the restaurant, her steps steady despite the storm inside her. She knew now what she had to do. Paris had shown her the truth, and that truth had burned away the last of her grief. All that remained was determination. Colton Hale had taken her trust, her money, and her peace of mind. But she still had one thing left, her will to fight. Amelia knew charging across that restaurant terrace would only end in disaster. Colton would laugh, deny, and twist the story until she looked like the bitter ex chasing ghosts. He was too slick, too practiced at manipulation. If she wanted justice, she had to be smarter than him. So she swallowed her rage and walked away, her mind already shifting from shock to strategy. The next morning, she sat in a small cafe with her notebook open, writing down everything she had seen and every detail she could remember. She thought about the transaction that drained her account, the ticket stub she had found, the hotels she had traced, the receipts she had tucked into her bag. Piece by piece, she began to see a pattern. Colton hadn't just disappeared. He had carefully orchestrated his new life, using her inheritance as the foundation. She started collecting evidence quietly. A friendly concierge at one hotel let slip that Mr. Hale had stayed there for weeks, leaving behind receipts with his name printed clearly. A waiter at another restaurant remembered him, bragging about business deals over expensive wine. Amelia gathered these fragments, tucking them into folders, each one a nail in the coffin she was building for him. Still, she knew paperwork wasn't enough. She needed someone who understood the system in France, someone who could help her make sense of the legal maze. Through persistence and a stroke of luck, she found a Parisian lawyer named Etienne Duval. He was older, measured in his words, and after hearing her story, he agreed to take her case. Men like this, he said with a grim smile, believe the world belongs to them. They never expect anyone to fight back. Etienne guided her through the process of documenting everything. Together, they traced financial transfers, highlighted falsified contracts Colton had used to convince her, and built a timeline of his actions. Amelia sat through long meetings, listening carefully, her anger keeping her focused when exhaustion threatened to drag her down. Each document she added to the pile gave her a sense of power returning. Meanwhile, she continued to watch Colton from a distance. She saw him stroll through markets with Sabine, buying art and antiques without a care. His arrogance blinded him. He never once looked over his shoulder, never suspected Amelia was still there. That arrogance was exactly what would trap him. He believed he was untouchable, and that belief would be his undoing. Amelia no longer felt like the woman left behind in an empty apartment. She was steady, deliberate, and patient. She didn't want revenge through chaos. She wanted justice that lasted. She wanted him stripped of the life he had built with her father's money, left with nothing but the consequences of his choices. As she slid another receipt into her growing folder, Amelia whispered to herself, "You thought I was finished, Colton. You were wrong." For the first time since the betrayal, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Amelia waited for the right moment. She had followed Colton long enough to know his routine. He liked a particular cafe not far from the Seine, always choosing a table outside where people could see him. He thrived on attention, leaning back in his chair as if the world belonged to him. That afternoon, the terrace was crowded, the air buzzing with conversation and the clink of glasses. Amelia walked straight toward him, her steps steady though her heart hammered in her chest. Colton looked up mid-sentence, his laughter dying instantly. For the first time since she had known him, his face drained of its usual confidence. His smile flickered, then returned in a weaker form, as if he could charm his way through this too. "Amelia," he said smoothly, though his voice carried an edge. "What a surprise. Following me across the ocean? That's dramatic." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed a leather folder on the table between them and slid into the empty chair. The cafe noise seemed to fade as she looked him directly in the eye. "I'm not here for drama," she said softly. "I'm here for the truth." Colton leaned back, trying to recover his usual arrogance. He laughed, shaking his head as though she were some obsessed woman who couldn't move on. You're making a scene, Amelia. You gave me money willingly. There's no crime in that. Maybe it's time to accept that I've moved forward. But then she opened the folder. Receipts, contracts, transfer records, all neatly stacked. She turned one page after another, laying them out like cards in a game only she controlled. You didn't just take my money, she said evenly. You built a lie. And now I can prove it. Colton's smirk faltered. His eyes darted to the papers, then back to her, the easy charm slipping away like paint washed off by rain. He reached for the documents, but Amelia's hand pressed them firmly down. Don't, she warned, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Across the table, Sabine's laughter had died completely. She picked up one of the receipts, her elegant fingers tightening as she read the name. Her gaze shifted from the paper to Colton, then back to Amelia. In that instant, the warmth in her eyes turned to ice. She realized she wasn't dining with a successful investor, but with a thief who had used another woman's inheritance to fund his performance. Is this true? Sabine asked quietly, though her voice carried steel. Colton stammered, words tumbling without direction, his smooth mask finally cracking. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back with visible disgust. The cafe, once filled with harmless chatter, now felt like a stage, every patron a silent witness to his unraveling. Amelia didn't shout, didn't cry. She simply gathered the papers back into the folder and stood. You thought I wouldn't find you, she said, her voice low but steady. But I did. And this, she tapped the folder, is enough to end everything you've built here. For the first time, Colton had nothing to say. His silence told Amelia more than any excuse could. She turned, leaving him sitting, in the shadow of his own lies, while Sabine's glare followed him like a blade. The moment Sabine realized the truth, she wasted no time. She was not the type of woman to sit quietly after being tricked. Within hours, she had contacted her legal advisors, showing them the papers Amelia had brought. What Amelia had collected was more than enough to raise alarm. Sabine moved quickly, using her influence in Paris to bring the matter to the attention of the authorities. Colton had always believed he was untouchable. He thought his charm and careful lies could protect him, but Paris was not so forgiving. Within days, his bank accounts were flagged and then frozen. Transactions that had once flowed freely were locked, leaving him stranded. The life of luxury he had built, hotels, fine dining, expensive suits, suddenly began to collapse like a house of cards. Amelia watched quietly from the sideline. She didn't need to shout or chase him anymore. The system, combined with Sabine's determination, was doing the work. Investigators uncovered inconsistencies in his documents. His visa status was questioned, and whispers spread through the city's social circle. The man who had once bragged about his connections was now whispered about as a fraud. Colton tried to reach out to Sabine, but she had cut him off completely. Her voice was cold and sharp when she finally spoke to him in public. You used me, she said. You used her, and you thought you were clever. But now you'll face the law. Her words struck deeper than any argument Amelia could have given. Colton was left isolated, stripped of allies, his arrogance replaced by panic. For Amelia, there was no joy in watching him fall, but there was peace. Part of her father's money was recovered through the frozen accounts, though not all. Still, the return wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was seeing the man who had betrayed her face consequences he could not escape. She had been left heartbroken, abandoned, and humiliated. But now the balance had shifted. In the weeks that followed, Colton's name disappeared from the glamorous spaces he once loved. Hotels refused him, his so-called friends turned their backs, and the authorities kept a close watch on his every move. The image he had worked so hard to build in Paris crumbled faster than Amelia could have imagined. The man who had laughed on terraces and ordered champagne now sat in cramped rooms, trying to explain himself to lawyers who no longer believed in his story. Amelia didn't attend every meeting or follow every detail of the legal fight. She didn't need to. She had already seen enough to know that Colton's days of pretending were over. What mattered to her was that dignity had been restored. She had not let him vanish without a trace. She had not let her father's legacy be reduced to a cruel memory. The downfall was not loud or dramatic in the way movies might show. It was quiet, steady, and certain. Amelia had chosen strategy over emotion, patience over anger. And in the end, that choice left Colton with nothing and gave her back her strength. Amelia walked through the airport with a calm she had not felt in months. The weight that once pressed on her chest was gone. She hadn't recovered every dollar of her father's inheritance, but what she gained was far more important. She had found her voice again. She had faced betrayal in its most brutal form and stood tall. Paris, a city she once thought would only remind her of heartbreak, had become the place where she rebuilt her strength. Back home, friends and colleagues noticed the change in her. She no longer carried the same guarded look in her eyes. When people asked about Paris, she didn't share all the details. She simply said, It gave me back something I thought I lost. That was enough. She didn't know anyone the full story, because the real victory was deeply personal. Amelia often sat in her father's study, where the inheritance papers were once kept. She thought of how proud he would have been, not because she recovered part of the money, but because she didn't let herself be destroyed by betrayal. Colton had tried to steal not only her savings, but her belief in love, trust, and her own judgment. Yet, she had taken all of that back. Sometimes her mind drifted to the image of Colton in Paris, his smirk fading when reality closed in on him. She didn't need to imagine his current life. She knew it was far from the luxury he once flaunted. For Amelia, justice wasn't about seeing him suffer day by day. Justice was knowing he could never erase the strength she had gained through his betrayal. Her nights became peaceful again. She could sleep without replaying the lies, without wondering where he had gone. The restless questions that once haunted her, why did he leave? How could he do this? Lost their power. She understood now that betrayal said more about him than it ever did about her. His choices reflected his emptiness, not her worth. Amelia also realized something important. Paris hadn't broken her spirit. It had saved her from staying blind to who Colton truly was. If she hadn't followed the trail, she might have spent years wondering, blaming herself, or doubting her instinct. Instead, she faced the truth directly, and it gave her closure. One evening, while walking along the river in her hometown, she whispered words to herself that felt final. He didn't win. And he hadn't. He had taken money, yes, but he could not take her dignity, her resilience, or her future. She carried herself differently now, not as someone who had been fooled, but as someone who had risen. Amelia knew new challenges would come in life, but she felt ready. Betrayal had taught her something no amount of comfort or security ever could, that strength often appears when everything else falls apart. She didn't just survive Colton's disappearance. She transformed because of it. Colton had tried to run from his actions, but in the end, he could not escape their weight. Amelia, on the other hand, walked forward freely. She was no longer defined by loss, but by the courage to claim herself again. And that was the true justice.